What's up guys, Clinton from GrimmSpeed here, and I'm going to be walking you through the installation for the GrimmSpeed Front Mount Intercooler kit for the 2015 Plus Subaru STI. Here's a quick overview of the tools you'll need for the installation, which should take about 2 to 3 hours depending on your level of experience. The first step in the installation is to take off the intake snorkel. There are 2 flathead clips to do this. Once we have that off, we can move to the upper front bumper trim. There are a variety of clips and bolts to remove here. Next, let's start the process of removing the OEM top mount intercooler. Loosen the bolts for the bypass valve. Then the 2 bolts that connect the crossover tube to the intercooler. Now let's loosen the mounting bolts for the intercooler. Don't forget this hose clip. And now we can loosen the worm clamps on the coupler connections. Once you have all the connections loosened, you can start to pry the intercooler off of the throttle body. There is a bracket underneath the intercooler that you could take off to make it a little bit easier. Now push the intercooler coupler off of the turbo outlet. This may take a little bit of extra maneuvering, but it will come off. Now we can raise the car up and start working underneath. One of the first things we're going to do underneath the car is take off the splash guard. There are a couple clips that need to be taken off and a couple bolts. Most of the bolts are 12mm. We will also need to take off the front bumper cover. To do this, there are some clips lining the front lip of the bumper. There are also a couple pop clips in the inside of the wheel wells. Once you have all the clips removed, you can pop off the front bumper cover. Now that we have the front bumper removed, we will want to take off the OEM crash bar. There are 4 12mm bolts on each side, top and bottom. Once all of those bolts have been removed, you can lift the crash bar off and place it aside. In order to make room for the new core, we're going to have to move the OEM horn. Loosen the bolt and slightly tilt the horn upwards. We also need to flip this sensor bracket. Next, we need to gain access behind the washer fluid reservoir tank. Do this by loosening the screws that are holding the reservoir onto the chassis. Also unplug the sensor. With the reservoir out of the way, use a 14mm socket wrench to remove these two bolts. Also remove the two 14mm bolts in the front. Once all the bolts are out, you can remove this brace. Now you can reattach the reservoir. Another thing we have to do in order to make room for the core is trim a little bit of plastic from this lower shield. Do the same for the other side. We are getting very close to being able to mount the new front mount intercooler core. We are going to use this threaded hole as a mounting location. Remove both the bolt and the clip. Now let's mount the mounting brackets on the front mount core. Now it's time to mount the intercooler onto the front of the car. You can use the included hardware to do this. Now use a 12mm wrench to tighten the brackets on the intercooler. Take one of your 90-degree couplers along with the worm clamps and install it on the throttle body. Now, take the pipe with the bypass flange on it and push it into the 90-degree coupler. The bracket on the pipe should line up with the holes on the manifold. Screw the mounting bracket bolts into the manifold. Now install the included bypass valve gasket and thread in the bolts. Next, let's tighten the worm clamps on the throttle body coupler. When doing this, make sure the worm clamp is below the bead on the throttle body. Now you can tighten the other worm clamp on the coupler. Next, find one of your straight couplers along with two medium-sized worm clamps and install it onto the other end of the pipe. Before we move on to the next section of piping, we want to take the included piece of rubber bulb and install it on the pinch weld in front of the battery. This will help protect the piping from damage during install and daily driving. Let's also disconnect the top of the washer fluid reservoir and push it to the side. Find another 90-degree coupler and install it to the end of this tube as shown. This is how the coupler should look on the pipe. We found it easier to install this section of piping from the front of the car instead of the top. Push this section up past the washer fluid reservoir and into the top of the engine bay. Then connect the pipe to the coupler. Go ahead and tighten the worm clamp, making sure that the worm clamp sits above the bead on the piping. Now take two more medium-sized worm clamps and slide them over the coupler on the bottom. Find these pieces in your kit: the shortest of the piping, two worm clamps, and an angled coupler. Take the coupler and apply the large side to the intercooler, like shown here. Find this short piping and push the short end of the piping into the intercooler. Now angle the pipe in such a way that you can push the other end into the other coupler. For correct fitment, you want this piping to be as close to the bumper structure as possible, so you may need to push the piping into the coupler pretty far. Again, when placing your worm clamps, you want to make sure that your worm clamp is behind the bead. This will ensure that you don't have any blow-offs later down the road. Now go through and tighten the rest of the worm clamps for this section. Our kit comes with a piece of bracketing that gives a little extra support for the intercooler piping. This bracket fits between the chassis and the air intake. Be sure to tighten that bolt down because you don't want the bracket to fall out due to vibrations. Find another straight coupler and attach it to this pipe as shown here. It may be a little bit easier to install this next piece of piping if you drop this plastic shield. Take your piping, coupler first, and feed it down this hole until it pops out of the bottom. Find the included nut, bolt, and washer combo and install it into the bracket as shown. Next, we need to install this coupler onto the turbo outlet. Use the two smaller worm clamps for this. Find another straight coupler in your kit and attach it to this pipe as shown here. Now you can install this pipe into this coupler. Slide two worm clamps over the straight coupler. Then push the lower piping into the straight coupler. Now find the last slightly angled coupler. Attach it to the last piece of piping like shown here. Long end of piping going into the intercooler. This part may take a little bit of extra maneuvering, but it should fit in. Again, for the correct fitment, we want this piping to be as close to the chassis as possible. With everything in place, you can go ahead and tighten the worm clamps, again making sure that the worm clamp sits right below the bead. Moving back up to the top side of the engine, we can make some minor adjustments here. We don't want the piping to be touching any of the components here, so we can adjust as needed. You can go through and tighten any of the leftover worm clamps. In order to get the splash shield put back into place, we need to cut a small piece out so it can fit around the piping. Chase is cutting a straight line down the side in front of the mounting point. Then cutting another line 2.5 inches over. With those lines cut, it should fit into place. One of the last steps in the installation process is to remove the crossover pipe. The crossover pipe consists of 2 rubber hoses and 2 metal tubes that run the width of the engine. With your fingers, you should be able to feel the metal tube inside of the rubber hose. You need to cut both hoses right where you feel the metal tube ends. The same thing needs to be done to the other side. Remove the crossover and place it aside. Find the included squeeze clamps in your kit and slip them over the hoses. Take the included T-hose connection and install it as shown. Using pliers, slide the clamps up and into place. Grab the rubber hose included in your kit and slide another clamp on. Then route the hose underneath the turbo outlet piping and into the T connection. Using your pliers, slide the clamp up the hose and into place. On the other side of the crossover tube, there is a sensor and a sleeve that needs to come off. The sensor should come off relatively easily, but the sleeve is glued onto the hose and needs to be pried off. Once you're able to get the sleeve off, slide the sensor back over the hose. Slide another squeeze clamp over the rubber hose. Then take the other included hose connector and push it into the hose. Now we need to cut the replacement hose to the desired length. Slide a clamp on. Then push the hose onto the other side of the plastic connector. To help stop wear over time, our kit also includes a small piece of Tech Flex wire loom. Find the section of hose that rubs against the intercooler piping and use the section of Tech Flex to protect it. For the last step of this install, we need to remove part of the OEM intercooler splitter. You just need to remove the soft rubber seal around the outside of the splitter. You can do this by pulling up on the tabs until it comes off. It may be a good idea to cut off the plastic tabs on the splitter as well. If you decide not to, you may hear rattling when you drive. At this point, we are reaching the end of the installation. You can go ahead and reinstall your front bumper. And reinstall your splash guard. If you have any further questions about the installation of the GrimmSpeed Front Mount Intercooler for the 2015 Plus Subaru STI, please feel free to give us a call or send an email to support@grimmspeed.com.